The course description is taken directly from the catalog, and so there's no need to go over that. And as far as the reason for the rationale for the second semester, what we want to do is build on the knowledge you gained in first semester. That's basic bottom line. That's what we're doing. And during this semester, we want to get you to the point to where you are handling the biblical text on a regular basis. We'll have a number of translation assignments. And with those translation assignments, we will build your repertoire in being able to look at the Hebrew text and read it for yourself. You need to have a Hebrew Bible. You need to have Holiday's lexicon in order for you to carry out these assignments. If you use a Hebrew Bible from online, or if you have software package, please make certain that you handle the matter of the Kethiv Kareh adequately. That occurs whenever you have a starred portion within the text, or it's in square brackets and you have the word repeated. And in those cases, you need to check to find out exactly what the Hebrew text has, as opposed to accepting either one of the two readings that are in your software. What happens in the software is that the editors of the software have taken the Kethiv and the Kareh. The Kethiv is that which is written in the text. The Kareh is what the Masoretes have put in the margin of the text. And they have added the pointings, because the Kareh in the margin that the Masoretes give is an unpointed Hebrew text. And so you have to hypothesize, you have to guess, basically, with an educated guess, hopefully, what the pointing would have been for that Hebrew text that is in the margin. And then on the written text, the reason you have a Kareh is because there has been some question regarding that text. And so then the editors sometimes then try to change the Masoretic pointing of that text to what they think it should have been. And so what you end up with in your software is two readings back to back, neither one of which matches exactly what is in the Masoretic text that has come down to us. So you have to check a hard copy at that point to find out exactly what the reading is. And I'll try to warn you about these as we come into each one, but you'll have to pay attention to that very carefully if you're using Hebrew Bible software rather than using a hard copy. We remember that we claim that the biblical text is our sole foundation for faith and practice. And the interesting thing is how often those who say they believe that in their preaching and teaching don't touch the Old Testament, don't preach the Old Testament, as though it is not practical, cannot be practiced, and has nothing to believe, therefore is not the foundation of faith. In the first week of January, we had the Doctor of Ministry students here on campus, and the third cohort was in the Old Testament section. And as we went around the room and talked to the men, it was interesting. 1 out of 6 had actually preached from the Old Testament in the past 5 years in their preaching ministry. And 2 out of the 6 in 10 years or more of ministry had not preached from the Old Testament at all. And so that gives your congregations a very skewed view of the Word. And so when you say that the Scriptures are the sole foundation of faith and practice, they're thinking the entire Bible, Old and New Testament, but in the pulpit that's never reinforced because all you preach from is the New Testament. And so one of the reasons you're taking Hebrew is so that that will not happen, so that you have the tools to exegete and to expound the Old Testament. And as we go through this semester, I'll be trying to reinforce some of that and to try to give you some tools to use that will help you in developing an outline of a Hebrew text, diagramming the Hebrew text, and preparing you then for the third semester of Hebrew, OT 603, the Introduction to Hebrew Exegetical Methodology. And at the same time, make certain that you begin to use that text and have the ability to use it even now in teaching and preaching. So that's part of our goal. And we'll be doing a translation in Genesis 37, Ruth 1, 1 Samuel 16, Psalm 103. We'll be using in Tuesday morning devotion starting next Tuesday. And I trust that you'll find that a time of reflection, on the text and thinking about how to apply it and utilize it. After all, 2 Timothy 3:16 says that all Scripture is God-breathed and profitable. That doesn't say only the New Testament is God-breathed and profitable. It doesn't say the Old and New Testaments are God-breathed, but only the New Testament is profitable. And profitable, it says there for doctrine. It doesn't limit it to the New Testament. There's doctrine in the Old as well. And it's for reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God might be complete or mature, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. And so that includes the Old Testament. In fact, when Paul wrote that, there were very few portions of the New Testament available. James would have been available, the first New Testament epistle, about 45 AD. The Gospel of Mark may have been available. The Gospel of Matthew may have been available. We know definitely that all the writings of John were not available at the time he penned that epistle to Timothy. We know that a number of the New Testament epistles, for example, like Thessalonians, had already been written by that time, but we don't know if it had actually been distributed to where everyone had it. We don't know for certain, for example, if the church at Ephesus, where Timothy was at the time, had the Thessalonian epistles in hand. And so when we look at that, it's obviously talking about and including the Old Testament, and verse 15 confirms it in the prior context, where it talks about Timothy, and it says that from a child he had known the Scriptures, because his grandmother Lois and his mother had taught him from those Scriptures, and that he knew those Scriptures were able to make him wise unto salvation. And so it's very clear by context that the Old Testament's included, and therefore it's profitable. And that's one of the things we want to try to do, and I want to model that by the way we go through Psalm 103 in a time of devotion at the start of each Tuesday's class. The course objectives are this. Basically, completing this course, you should be able to read aloud the Hebrew of any passage in the Hebrew Old Testament. And I mean that, any passage. And there will be days, especially starting in about a month's time, that when we come to class, I may ask you just to turn to a certain passage, or I'll put a passage up on the screen here and ask you to read it aloud, pronounce it. We want to practice that. We want to make certain that you have good pronunciation abilities and are able to read the Hebrew text. Secondly, you should be able to identify the basic grammatical elements of Old Testament Hebrew. And by this, I mean specifically the syntactically and exegetically significant elements of Hebrew. There are many elements of Hebrew, for example, the genders of the verbs, of the nouns, and the adjectives. And the pronouns and pronominal suffixes. We can talk about gender, but it's not exegetically significant. They are markers that helps to see agreement between terms in the passage and to mark proper relationships. But it's not something that is going to blow the lid off exegetically or interpretatively. So those are not necessarily exegetically significant, but there are those elements. In fact, there's 12 basic grammatical elements for biblical Hebrew that are exegetically significant. Ones that if you see them in any passage that you have, you know that you have something that you can really grasp hold of and run with as you interpret and expound the text. They are exegetically significant. Third, you should be able to translate selected narrative portions of the Hebrew Old Testament. And I say narrative portions there, but we will be looking at other portions. We'll be doing translation in prophetic literature. We'll be doing translation in legal literature. We'll be doing translation in poetic literature. So you'll have across the board the gamut of different genres or types of literature available. And you'll get experience in each of those. And we'll talk about their characteristics and what to watch for in looking at those. But the narrative portion is what I want you specifically to finish this course very familiar with and very comfortable with. And we'll continue to work on the other genres then in the third semester. Lastly, you should be able to outline a basic exegetical methodology for preparing sermons from the Old Testament. Again, I don't want you to wait to third semester to begin to learn some of these principles. I want you to begin to learn some of them now, so that as you have opportunity to preach from the Old Testament, you will actually proceed to do so when you have the opportunity, and to use your Hebrew as much as possible. On the required textbooks, the grammar again that you had for last semester, and the workbook, and also Holiday's Hebrew Lexicon, and then Putnam, Frederick Clark Putnam Hebrew Bible Insert. Be certain that you bring this to class with you. By the time we finish the semester, you and I will have memorized portions of this. You'll be able to cite portions of it saying, well, section 1.8.1 has to do with the construct state. 1.8.2 has to do with apposition. Go on down through the line there. 3.3.3 is where you go for discussion of hine. Section 4 is where you go for discussion of the accents. Those will become so familiar to you. And as you go into third semester, this is going to be used heavily again. So keep this handy. Make certain that you have it. Bring it to class with you for every class hour. On our schedule, today we're going to start with chapter 20. That was where we wanted to be last semester, but circumstances prevented me from picking up and finishing that with you. So we're going to start there with a discussion of the while correlative and while consecutive. Your first assignment is on Thursday. Thursday, you are to have exercise 20. Exercise 20 is due on Thursday. There's nothing due today except reading chapter 20. Many of you read that last semester anyway. So chapter 20 workbook exercise is due on Thursday. The first vocabulary quiz will be next Tuesday, 1 week from today. It will be on chapter 21. So let's turn to chapter 21 now, and let's take a look at that vocabulary. Page 135, I believe. And let's go over the vocabulary. This will be the only vocabulary for the vocab quiz a week from today. And by the way, the exercise for chapter 21 will be due the same day. So 1 week from today, the exercise for chapter 21. Exercise for chapter 21. All right. Please pronounce these after me. As I go through, I'm starting up the upper right-hand corner and reading across the top line. Nasa.
Nasa.
This verb means he departed or he left. He departed or he left. Kasa.
Kasa.
He covered or he concealed. He covered or he concealed. In the Psalms, when the psalmist talks about covering sin in the sense of forgiving sin, this is the verb that is used, kasa. It can also be used to conceal or to cover up something, to hide it. The third word there on the upper left-hand corner is nachal.
Nachal.
Means he inherited or he possessed. This is a very frequently occurring verb, especially starting in Deuteronomy and going on through Joshua and Judges and many of the historical books, and then again appearing frequently in the Psalms and the prophets. He inherited, he possessed, often talking about Israel possessing the land or the tribes inheriting certain portions, nachal. Okay, the second line, kafer.
Kafer.
Kafer means he wiped clean or he made atonement for. Yom Kippur is from the same root, kippur. It means to cover. Kipporet is the atonement cover on the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant has this lid on it with the cherubim, and that is called a kipporet. It's called the place of atoning, a place of atonement. So the kafer is a very significant theological term in the Old Testament. He wiped clean, he made atonement for. Then we have the noun that is related to the verb we had in the top line. Nachala.
Nachala.
Nachala means inheritance or possession. Notice it has the same triliteral root. It has the nun, the cheth, and the lamed. The a suffix shows you that it is a feminine noun. It's a feminine noun. Nachala. The next one is lavesh.
Lavash.
Lavash means he was clothed. Notice that the tsere under the beth. That indicates that we have a verb that is a stative verb. A stative verb. Verbs, remember, that are in the form like katal, kathav, karath, malak, shamer, those verbs are not statives. They are normally looked at as active verbs or fientives. They are action verbs. The verbs that have the tsere in the cal perfect third masculine singular, as this one, are primarily then stative verbs. We also have an O-class vowel there, like in katon. Katon means he was small. Yakol, he was able. Those are also stative verbs. Other stative verbs like this one, like lavesh, are verbs like malay. Who can tell me what malay means? Full. He was full. Kaved. What does kaved mean? He was heavy. He was heavy. He was honored. Kaved. This is the verb root from where we get the noun form kavod that means glory. Okay? It's that which is heavy, that which has honor, that which has significance. So notice that tsere, that indicates a stative verb form, as we have here with lavesh. So it has a form of the verb to be in its translation. He was clothed. He was clothed. That's his state. All right, the third word is one that you're familiar with. We've had before. It's one of the segolate nouns, although it doesn't have a segol in it. Notice it's accented on the first syllable. That's one of the clues for a segolate noun. It's accented on the first syllable. This is na'ar. Na'ar means youth. But don't be confused by that. Sometimes that youthfulness is relative. For example, Absalom, at the time he died, is called Na'ar by both the men around David and by David. But at that time, Absalom had children. He was married and had children. He was probably in his late 20s or even in his 30s, but he is called Na'ar. So be careful. This is one of those areas where when you do a word study, you can go overboard, because Na'ar usually is a youth somewhere between, say, the ages of 13 or 14 up until the mid-20s, a young person. And as you look at that, you're tempted to always classify that individual that way. But we find it used in a much broader sense. And sometimes it's even just used of those who are in a subordinate role to someone else, in that they are being instructed in what they should do or how they should behave. And so it can refer to a student of a teacher or a master, and that can be left open as to how old that individual is. He might have a 60-year-old teacher. He might be 30 years old. He's 30 years junior, and therefore he is considered Na'ar. So be very careful how you follow these through and apply them. And when we use the translation youth there, keep in mind it doesn't necessarily always mean someone in the mid-20 down to 13 or 14 years of age. It can be older, just like Absalom. The next word is nous. Nous, notice, is a middle vowel verb. The shurik there as the middle radical. And as such then, it is a cal infinitive construct, and therefore we translate it as to flee. When it is used in the cal perfect, we translate it as he fled. But this form is the infinitive. Therefore, the perfect translation is put in parenthesis in your vocabulary there. Aon.
Aon.
And then this is alternatively pronounced awon.
Awon.
And if you are taught the modern Hebrew pronunciation, it would be pronounced avon.
Avon.
Okay, so you have three pronunciations. Why do we have three pronunciations of this one word? Number one, we do not know exactly how it was pronounced. Whether the wow is considered just a part of the holum and therefore is a full letter vowel and therefore to be pronounced only as on, on, or whether it is supposed to be pronounced as a consonant. The wow is a consonant and a simple holum above it. And most of the textbooks will take it as a consonant. Most textbooks will take it as a consonant. Part of that is due to the Semitic root that has that wow as a consonant in the verb form. This is a noun. And so most will attempt to pronounce it either as avon or awon. Modern Hebrew pronunciation being applied to classical Hebrew uses the V sound for the wow rather than a W sound for the wow that is the classical Hebrew pronunciation. So you will see this transliterated 3 different ways. You'll have professors or readers that will pronounce it 3 different ways as well. The best educated guess is that the wow should be considered as a consonant. So it'd be a W or a V here, awon or avon. But you will see all 3. This term is often translated simply as sin. But there are other words translated as sin. Chata means sin. It's the idea of missing the mark, coming short. Chata, the cheth, teth, and aleph. And then you also have the word for rebellion, being used. Pesha is used for transgression or rebellion, pesha. And so there's different words here for sin. I would never translate awon as sin unless it is not used in a context where other words for sin are utilized. If chata is used in the context anywhere, don't translate awon as sin, because chata will be translated as sin. And it is normally the idea of iniquity or guilt. Iniquity or guilt. Iniquity has the concept of being not according to the standard that God has set. Or it has the idea of guiltiness, or it has the idea of wickedness. And so that's where it normally is placed, iniquity or guilt. Those are the two translations that are most common. It still can be translated as sin, but only in those contexts where no other synonym of sin occurs. All right, let's go to the 4th line, naga. Naga, he touched. He touched. Then the next one is a noun that is written 2 different ways. One with a simple holum, and one with a full letter holum wow. And it is pronounced olah. Olah. Olah is a feminine noun. You can tell that because the comma's hey ending. It means burnt offering. Burnt offering. It is actually from the root Allah. What does this root mean? Anyone? He ascended, or it ascended. He ascended, it ascended, went up, rose, Allah. Okay? And it's from that root that this noun is formed. And it's when you burn something up, it basically ascends in the smoke. All the particles become light and ascend in the smoke, and perhaps can fall as soot elsewhere, or you have embers or soot remaining in the place where it is burnt, but it's viewed as that which ascends. And so a burnt offering is viewed figuratively as ascending to God in the smoke. It is burned up. All right, the last word in that line is nagash. Nagash. Nagash means he drew near or he approached. He drew near or he approached. And the last word in the vocabulary is the noun there at the lower right-hand corner, tzon. Tzon literally refers to sheep, but sometimes it's used of a flock, and that flock can include sheep and or goats. Can include sheep and or goats. It's primarily sheep, but it will be used sometimes in a context where it's referring to a flock, and that flock as a group can have this word, and it can refer to either sheep or sheep and goats mixed in together. Tzon. Any questions on the vocabulary? This will be for the vocab quiz 1 week from today. All right, let's go back then to chapter 20, if you would please. Starting on page 125. You have there in the exegetical insights Deuteronomy 23:10. I will read it word by word, and for example, the first 2 words are going to be read together. Why will I read them together? Anyone? Okay, Gus has it there. The makef, that line between the 2 words, indicates that those 2 words are to be pronounced as one word. Therefore, there's going to be no pause between them. They'll be read as one word. Notice that you have the secondary accent under the first vowel, and that's a secondary accent, the metheg, and therefore it's going to be pronounced, and then the seri under the tau is not going to have an accent, and then the major accent comes on the next one. So it's ki teitse, ki teitse. Everyone? Ki teitse. Machaneh. Al oyeveka. Wanish marta. Mikol. Davar. Ra. Now the ra would normally be ra with a pathak. Why is the pathak changed to a comments here? Anyone remember what we talked about here on this in the past? I heard someone say it. It's accented. It's one of the major accents. When you have a major disjunctive accent, like the athnak in the middle of the verse, and here at the end, the saluk plus the sof pasuk, the 2 diamonds at the end, then that is considered to be in pause. In pause. And when you have the pathak in pause, it is normally heightened to a comments. And so it becomes ra instead of ra. Now, as we look at these, on ki teitse, the teitse is the cal imperfect second masculine singular from the verb yatsa, which means go out. He went out. And here it's second masculine singular, so it's you went out because you went out, okay, because you went out. And the machaneh is a word that means camp. It's a noun that means camp. You went out to the camp, or you went out from the camp, depending on the translation in context. We'd have to look at all of it here in context. Al oyeveka, the ka ending is what? Anyone? Second masculine singular pronominal suffix. And oyev is the noun meaning enemy. The yod between the beith and the kaf sofit at the end indicates that it is a plural noun. A plural noun. And so it's your enemies. Your enemies. So Al here, you went forth from the camp against your enemies. Against your enemies. Al doesn't mean just upon, over. It also means against, and especially in a context when you're talking about fighting, when you're talking about conflict, when you're talking about debate, when you're talking about legal actions, then oftentimes it has the meaning of against your enemies. And then wanish marta is what we call a wow correlative. It's a wow on a perfect verb. The wow on a perfect verb we call a wow correlative. This is a nifal perfect. We know it's nifal because it has the noon and hirik. We know it's a perfect because it has the ta suffix. That ta suffix occurs only in perfects. When you have the tau with vowels on the end of a verb, that's always a perfect form. And when you have a perfect verb, you identify the stem or the conjugation of that verb by merely pronouncing it. Nishmarta, nishmarta. And the name is there. And the only verb conjugation that begins with a noon and a hirik, a ni sound, is nifal. Kal doesn't begin with ni. Piel doesn't begin with ni. Pual doesn't begin with ni. Hifil doesn't begin with ni. Hofal doesn't begin with ni. Hithpael doesn't begin with ni. Only nifal. Therefore, you know this is a nifal. It's a nifal perfect. It's a nifal perfect. The ta ending matches the personal pronouns. Which personal pronoun does it match? Pronounce it. Ata. Ata. And that ta is the clue. So it is a nifal perfect, second masculine singular. You don't need to memorize the nifal paradigm of all the forms of the nifal, because all nifal perfects will begin with a ni, and the ending will be always a perfect ending. Therefore, it's very clear that this is a nifal. It has no other options. There's nothing else available. You know it by knowing the name of the stems. Nifal is the only one that begins with ni. You know it by knowing the personal pronouns, because you know the personal pronoun endings are the endings for the perfect of the verbs. And it's across the board, whether it's kal, whether it's nifal, piel, pual, hifil, hafal, or hithpael. All second masculine singular perfects will end in ta. All of them. This is why we memorize only the kal. There's no need to memorize all the others. You can deduce the forms and the parsings. All right? So this is you were kept. You were kept. And you were kept, so you were kept. We'll have to determine that by context, but we can say for certain, and you were kept. Were kept because, remember, nifal is a passive. Nifal is a passive. You were kept. And then we come to the last part. Mikol. How do we identify Mikol? Anyone? From all. How do we divide the parts? The maim is for what? Min. What happened to the noon in min? All right, it assimilated, and therefore in compensation, the letter it was assimilated into is doubled. So you have a doubling dogish in it. So it's mik-kol. Mik-kol. It's a doubled kaf. The noon is assimilated into the following letter, which is the kaf, and in compensation of the assimilation, in other words, because the noon has disappeared, it's been assimilated, then that letter is doubled in compensation to compensate for it. Mikol. From every or from all. Davar means what? Word or matter or thing. All right? And then ra or ra, here in this case, means what? Bad or evil. From every evil thing. You were kept from every evil thing. Okay? Because is one possible way of translating the key. When you read the whole thing, notice, if we translate it as because, notice the meaning. Because you went out from the camp against your enemies, so you were, and you were kept from every evil thing. Or is the key then to be translated as when? When you went out from the camp against your enemies, you were kept from every evil thing. Or is it if? If you go out from the camp against your enemies, then you will be kept from every evil thing. Key has many meanings. It can mean because, which is the same thing as for, F-O-R. It can mean when. It can mean if. And the only way to determine this is to look at the entire context and find out exactly what it is. Notice, though, if you translate as because or when, the wow on the perfect is not translated. If you translate it as a conditional sentence, if, then the wow becomes the equivalent of then, because you have the protosis, if. Protosis means that which is set in front of, which arranged in front of. Pro, in front of. Tosis, from the Greek verb tasso, I arrange. And that then forms the protosis, that which is placed before first, the if, the condition. And then the fulfillment of the condition is called the apotheosis. Apotheosis is A-P-O-D-O-S-I-S. Apa in Greek means what? From. Endosis is a nominal form that is derived from didomi, and didomi has the idea to give. And so it's that which is given from. Given this, if, then given from that condition, then, you see. This is the subsequent, this is the result of the conditional thing. So the first part is protosis. Protosis, if you wanted to put it in your notes, is an A in it. Okay, protosis. All right, so this is most likely to be a conditional sentence and is then saying, if you go out from the camp against your enemies, then you will be kept from every evil thing. It's a promise, evidently, to be fulfilled upon the condition that they go out against the enemy. And in Deuteronomy, you can pretty well guess what this is going to be about. If you're familiar with the book of Deuteronomy, you know the only narrative really in the book is in the first 4 chapters, when you have a summary of the history of their wandering through the wilderness and their leaving of Egypt. And then you have 3 sermons by Moses. And those 3 sermons move all the way down through chapter 26. And the 3 sermons are basically an exposition of the law, which is given in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The 10 Commandments are given in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And then commandment by commandment, each section of the 3 following sermons then picks up on that law and expounds. First of all, expounds the first of the 10 commandments, and then expounds the second, etc., all the way through. And at chapter 26, when Moses completes or gets to the end of his 3rd sermon, he then launches into the covenant ratification ceremony, in how they are then, when they get into the land, to pronounce the blessings and the curses that as they stand. Some of the people at the foot of Mount Ebal and some of the people at the foot of Mount Gerizim. And they're to follow through this covenant renewal and commitment ceremony. And then with that commitment ceremony, you have the blessings and curses in 27 and 28. And then he reveals the Palestinian covenant, which is to reveal to them the promises concerning the land in chapter 29. And then in chapter 30, he gives them a preview of the new covenant. And that completes his 3rd sermon. Some make that a separate covenant renewal context, dealing with the 3 covenants, dealing with the Sinaitic covenant and its renewal and commitment ceremony, and then dealing with the Palestinian covenant, which is added to that, and then dealing with the preview of the new covenant. And then in chapter 31, we return to narrative, have the ordination of Joshua and the transition of the time in which Moses is going to die. He's given instructions concerning the fact that God wants him to write a song and teach it to the people of Israel. And that song is in chapter 32. And then prior to his death, he gives his blessings in chapter 33. And chapter 34, we have his death. So if you have that concept, if you've learned in your Old Testament survey course a basic outline of the book of Deuteronomy, you know then that chapter 23 is within the sermon that he's preaching, the 3rd sermon. Therefore, the you here is probably Moses then addressing the people of Israel. If not, it's God addressing Moses, but we know that Moses is not going to enter into the land and won't be going out against his enemies. They're on the plains of Moab as he preaches. They're not going to have any more battles before they leave the plains of Moab. So we know historically this has to be then addressed to Israel. And therefore, this is Moses saying to Israel, according to the leading of the Spirit of God, according to the revelation God has given him, if you, Israel, then go out from the camp against your enemies, then you will be kept from every evil thing. Okay? So that's one of the ways to get to a context, to try to understand it, is just by a basic general knowledge of the book of Deuteronomy, having a basic outline in mind. Yes?
Would you use, so it would be okay to use the second masculine singular to refer to the nation of Israel?
Yes, it is. In fact, it's very significant. When it's used in the singular as opposed to the plural, there's a difference in meaning. There's a difference in meaning. Eugene Merrill, in his commentary in the New American Commentary series, discusses that and gives the significance of it. And also you have that significance talked about in Harrison's commentary in the Tyndale Old Testament commentary series. I know of no other commentaries that really discuss it. Christensen skips over it. Some of the liberal commentators treat it as an inconsistency in the book and indicate that it's due to different editors, that you go from a plural second person to a singular second person. But in reality, the reason for the singular is in order to demonstrate, and I'll have to go back and take a look at this and remind myself, because I have to go back. My mind is getting to the point where I have to review it. There are two possibilities here. When you have a plural, it could be the idea of distributive to each and every single one of you, all of you individually, or it can be collective, all of you together, and the singular can be taken either individually, each one, or it can be taken collectively of the nation as a whole. And if I remember right, the way that Merrill and Harrison took this as the singular is the way to assign the responsibility to each and every individual within the nation of Israel. And when the plural is used, they're being addressed as a group. All of you are to do this, but it's the all concept, all of you. And so in that case here, this would be the emphasis of the second person singular, if that is correct there, if I remembered that correctly, would be on the individuals, that every single individual of you in the nation of Israel have this promise to claim individually due to individual obedience. Okay? All right. Now, let's go, having covered that briefly, let's go then to the while consecutive discussion on the bottom of the page there. The while consecutive, remember, is the form of the verb that is the imperfect. The while consecutive is never used of a perfect. You will find the term while consecutive used by Chisholm. You'll find while consecutive used by Putnam even, of referring to any verb, imperfect or perfect, that has a while on it. The problem is that when they use that terminology, it does not distinguish between the usages of the two. It does not distinguish. And so in our grammar that we've done here, we try to make certain that we've distinguished between the two. So the while consecutive will be reserved only for those verbs that are imperfects that are prefixed by a while with an A-class vowel under it. And normally a dogish in the prefix letter of the imperfect. There's one prefix letter that will not take the dogish. That's the aleph of the first person common singular. For example, if we're looking at the verb ektol, that's kal imperfect, first common singular. The aleph is a guttural, so therefore it will what? It'll refuse to be doubled. It will reject the doubling dogish. When you have that occur, then, this, to compensate for the rejection, heightens the pathic to a comets. But it will always be one of those A-class vowels. It'll be a comets if it's before the guttural aleph. It will be the pathic before the tau prefix, before the yod prefix, and the noon prefix. The noon is the first common plural prefix. So these are the only four imperfect prefixes. Doesn't matter whether it's kal, nifal, hifil, hafal, piel, pual, or hithpael. Those are the only four prefixes on imperfects. Those prefixes will be doubled following this wow, except for the aleph. And therefore, it changes to a comments. So in all of these cases, it is an A-class vowel. It's not a schwa. It will not be a shurik, as we've seen before labials, because there's no labial as a prefix for the imperfect. So this is only found in the imperfects. It is not found anywhere else. The imperfect verbs are the only verbs that can be wow consecutive. We call it consecutive because there's a consecution of events, a sequence. Consecutive means sequential, sequential. So when you have the wow consecutive verb, it's found primarily in narrative. You have a sequence of events that are in order logically or chronologically. Therefore, they're always translated with particles to translate that wow as so, if it's logical order, therefore, thus, or if it is chronological, then. But you know when you see these verb forms, and we call these verbs because of this wow, and because of the A-class vowel, and because of the doubling here of the prefix letter, we call them wayik-tol, or in the modern Hebrew pronunciation, vayik-tol. All right? So you'll hear these called wow consecutives, and you'll hear them called wayik-tols. We're referring to the exact same thing. John?
So these are only found in imperfects?
Only imperfects. No other form of the verb.
Usually in a narrative?
Normally in narrative. They are found elsewhere.
And it has an A-class vowel with a dogish.
A-class vowel would be the pathic when it's a dogish, but if you have a comments, then it's not going to have the dogish because it's been rejected by the guttural aleph in the first common singular and been heightened to the comments. The comments only occur in first common singular. Only in first common singular. Okay, everyone clear on that? Wow consecutive verbs are verbs that are imperfects with a wow prefix that has an A-class vowel, and in all except the aleph, that A-class vowel is a pathic, and the doubling dogish is found in the following prefix letter that's on that imperfect. The prefix is what is doubled. The prefix is doubled. Remember yik-tol, tik-tol, tiktali, ek-tol, yik-tolu, tiktolna, and as you go on down through there, tiktalu, tiktolna, niktol. Those are all the imperfects in the kal imperfect of katal. Those are the only verbs we're talking about. Imperfects. Regardless of the stem or conjugation, across the board, kal, nifil, nifal, hifil, hafal, piel, pual, hithpael, any imperfect that has a wow with an A-class vowel on it. If it's an aleph, it'll be a comets because the doubling dogs will be rejected. The others will have it. Now, there are some forms where you'll have the form of the verb will call for a missing doubling dogish even in, for example, the yod. Wayehi does not have a dogish in it. And the reason for that is because of the schwa that is found here. And this is a shortened form because normally the kal imperfect third masculine singular is yiheyeh. All right, that's the full form of the kal imperfect third masculine singular. And this is from the root haya. He was. All right? This form is normally a jussive form. Wayehi means, and it came to be. And it came to be. For example, in Genesis chapter 1, God says, let light come into being. He says, yehi or, Yehior, let it come into being. It is the jussive of a decree, and the imperfect of the stative verb is the idea of transition happening. Let it come into being, let it happen. And then you have Wayehi, so it came into being, so it happened. Wayehi. And it does not have the doubling dogish in it. So there are a few exceptions, but this still indicates that this is a Wayik Tol. And therefore it has to do with sequence. And in that case, God said, let light come into be, let it come into existence. So, or then, it came into being. It is sequential. He first spoke, and then secondly, it came to be. It's sequential. And that's the key. The Wayik Tol forms of the verb, or what we call the wow consecutives, are always sequential. Always sequential. Whether it's in narrative, whether it's in poetry, or whether it's in prophecy. Whether it's past time, present, or future. They are always sequential. They're always sequential. Now, because they're characteristic of narrative, and narrative is characteristically describing events that have already taken place, it is most often then past tense. But don't make the mistake of calling the Wayik Tol or the wow consecutive a preterite. Preterite is an old-fashioned English grammar term that was taught in English grammars in the 1920s through the 1940s. In fact, by the 1940s, it began to disappear completely. And so only your grandparents would have known what a preterite was in English grammar. Preterite is old-fashioned English for saying past tense. Past tense. But as you'll find out next semester, when we have Chisholm as a textbook from exegesis to exposition published by Baker, he says to use preterite is inadequate and inaccurate. Why? Because the Wayik Tols are not always past tense. And before that even, you have to understand, as he points out 6 times in that textbook, the tense of a Hebrew verb is determined by context and context alone, never by form. Context. If you're in a context of narrative, it's going to most likely be past tense. But it's context that determines that, not the verb form. Okay? All right, before the break, we were talking about the Wayik Tol or wow consecutive. What is the one-word summary of the meaning of that verb form? Sequence. Sequence. Don't forget it. You'll be asked that again and again and again and again. You'll get this hammered into you the way that you've had the 3 rules for the gutturals hammered into you. We're going to focus on that. We're going to emphasize that over and over and over again. Now, when we talk about the second form, it is called the wow correlative. This is wow consecutive on the imperfect, but the wow used on the perfect is called a wow correlative. It's called wow correlative, first of all, because it has a wow on the front of it, and it's called correlative because of the fact that it shows the relationship between that verb and other verbs in the context, but that relationship is not automatically sequential. In fact, it is merely a logical relationship. And as we emphasize the logical aspect of that relationship, that means that it might be something that is sequential. If this, then this, as we saw there in Deuteronomy chapter 23 in the exegetical insights, Deuteronomy 23:10. That's a logical relationship, and it is sequential. But it's primarily logical and only secondarily sequential. But most of the logical relationships will not be sequential. When you have cause and effect, when you have a condition, if and then it will be logical, but all the other logical relationships are not that way. And so it is not necessarily sequential. It's not necessarily chronological. It is merely a logical relationship. And it is a wow on the perfect, any perfect. And so the wow will primarily be a schwa, because that's the simple wow. If the verb is like bakash, which here is a cal perfect third masculine singular, because this is a labial, then instead of having a schwa, this is going to become a shurik. But it'll always be a simple wow. It will never be a wow that has an A-class vowel under it. A wow with an A-class vowel only occurs on an imperfect that is wayik tol. Only there, nowhere else. Okay? Let me back off that one more time here. There are times when you will have a pathic under a wow that is supposed to be a simple wow if you have a verb that has an A-class vowel at the beginning that takes a compound schwa, a hativ pathic, then the corresponding full vowel will be used in those cases, but there will not be the doubling dogish. So there are some exceptions to that. We'll have to talk about that as we get into weak verb forms. But in the strong verb forms, you're not going to find it. All right? So you'll expect to see a simple schwa under a wow, or you expect to see a shurik in this type of situation where you have a wow on a perfect. The wow correlative is only on perfects, not on imperfects. The wow consecutive is on imperfects, not on perfects. All right? The wow correlative is characteristic of prophetic literature. Prophetic literature. Whereas the wow consecutive is characteristic of narrative. Now, why would sequence be characteristic of narrative? Because of the fact that if you're talking about events that have already occurred, you know what the sequence is. They have already happened. They're history. Therefore, you can lay them out one by one in narrative. Now, if the wow consecutive occurs in future context or present context, it's still sequential, but it may not be as easy to know. Most prophetic contexts do not show the sequence of events clearly. The sequence of events are not always given. So that as you're going through a series of prophetic pronouncements, say in the book of Isaiah, one verb after another using the wow correlative, you may not be able to say anything about the sequence of those events. You don't know exactly which one is first, second, third, fourth, or fifth, because they're still yet future. And there's sometimes gaps in between, and sometimes there's relationships that show that actually one event actually preceded another. But you only know that by a careful examination of the context or of other parallel passages. So in future contexts like that, as in prophetic passages, the wow correlative is used because the sequence of events cannot always be clearly seen or understood or is not clearly revealed. That's why it's characteristic of a prophetic passage. So it's the wow correlative, and it's sometimes then known as the we katal form, because katal is nothing more than taking the perfect form, like katal, and giving its form, the same as in the wayik tol, we took yik tol as part of the name because it's still an imperfect. It's wayik tol because it's a wa on an imperfect. And yik tol is the cal imperfect third masculine singular, so it becomes the name for all imperfects. Instead of imperfect, you can say yik tol. You can also call it prefix forms of the verb, because the imperfect has prefixes. The perfect has suffixes and no prefixes. So it can be called the suffix conjugation. So an imperfect can be called imperfect, yik tol, or prefix conjugation. The perfect can be called perfect, can be called katal, and it can be called suffix conjugation. Those are three names of exactly the same thing. There's no difference, there's no distinction. So we call this we katal, the we because of the wow, the simple wow with the schwa. Now, when we get into third semester, we'll talk about how that there's two different major functions of the wekatal form of the Hebrew verb. We will not get into it in this semester. So when I talk about the wow correlative, there's also what some would call a non-wow correlative wekatal. Wow on a perfect. And Chisholm talks about that. I think it's legitimate. And I think that the reason he has to say non is because he's been using wow consecutive for the wekatal. And so he has to admit that 50% of wekatal is not consecutive. It doesn't have sequence to it by context and by understanding. And so he divides them into those that are sequential and those that are not. So he has a wow consecutive wekatal and he has a non-wow consecutive wekatal. You avoid that if you just use our terminology of wow correlative for all of those forms. And understand that some will be sequential by context because cause and effect is a logical relationship that is sequential. Conditional sentences are normally wow correlatives, and they are normally sequential by definition. The if precedes the then. Usually you have to do something before then the condition is fulfilled. And so in those cases, yes, those are consecutive, but you just cause confusion by dividing it all up. It's just simply better to say the wekatal is wow correlative. And that's what we've done. That way you can identify all wows on perfects as wow correlatives. They all show logical relationship. And some will have a logical relationship that happens also to be sequential in nature. Okay? That helps to explain our thinking, our philosophy, and why we've written the definition and used these terms. Any questions? Now, how do you translate these? Most of the time, a simple and will do. But as we've already seen in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 10, the wed nishmarta, a wow correlative perfect there, had to be translated as then. The wow was translated as then, because the relationship that it's in, it's correlated with a protasis of a conditional sentence. Therefore, then is the proper translation. So then will be used, sometimes so or thus, to show logical relationships. There will be times when it will be translated as because, where the cause will be the wow correlative, and the effect will be ahead of it, so that the order is not sequential. Although there's a sequential concept involved, the order of the verbs is not going to be sequential. Because the because can be placed first or it can be placed last. Because he was overweight, he decided to have an exercise program. That because is sequential in nature. It is first, and the following is the result. But if we say he entered a weight reduction program because he was overweight, the because he's overweight comes after the first verb, but it's actually before. So it's not sequential, but it has the same logical relationship of cause and effect. And that same fluidity that we have in English, to put because either before or after. We can put the effect before or after. The cause before or after is the same thing you have in Hebrew. Cause always comes before effect logically in our thinking. There's a sequence, but not in grammar and in our sentences. It is not always placed first. Therefore, it's not a sequential verb form in those situations where it's placed differently. If the cause is placed first, it's sequential. If the cause is not, it is not sequential. And that's why you have these differences and why we say the wow correlative has that flexibility. There is not that kind of flexibility in wayik tol. Wayik tol is inflexibly sequential. Okay? So that as you say it, that is the order. both logically and chronologically. I think that the textbook is self-explanatory on the forms for the while correlative and the while consecutive. They're on page 126 under 2B on forms. It gives you the variety of forms that can be found. On the additional notes, I think we've covered almost all of these at this time. There is sometimes a change of the accent on these verb forms, but that does not need to concern us at this point to any great degree. The change in the accenting is sometimes pointed to as a means of indicating that there's actually a wow conversive function going on, where the wow converts the verb form. That's an old-fashioned concept, that wayik tol converts an imperfect into a perfect, and that wekatal converts a perfect into an imperfect. But it does not do that. And the wayik tol is still an imperfect. It is still to be treated as an action that looks at the nature and process of that action internally. And the perfect on wekatal is still a perfect and is still looked at as a simple statement of fact, or looking at the action as a whole. It does not convert it, does not change it. And that's an area that, to get into the detail of it, you'd have to get into advanced Hebrew grammar, where we have a thorough and full discussion of that and the argumentation for it, but just take my word for it for the time being. And today, the vast majority of Hebraists do not hold to a wow conversive. I would say it's down now to about 5% of Hebraists still hold on to a wow conversive. When I was in seminary, it was like a 90% held to a wow conversive. And so it's changed a lot. And I think it's changed for the better. It's changed to be more consistent with the actual facts of the usage and the forms and the consistency of the verb as it's used in biblical Hebrew. My hero, Alexander Sperber, used to hammer the concept that if you're going to talk about biblical Hebrew grammar, you must describe the grammar as it is used in the biblical text and not to impose upon it the grammar of Akkadian or of Ugaritic or any other language. You must look at the usage in the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew Bible alone to define classical Hebrew grammar. And people have finally begun to do that. And it took all of the 40s through 60s to hammer this out and make the transition. And what was the catalyst for all that? Well, the catalyst came about by the discovery of Ugaritic, number one, when the Ugaritic tablets were discovered at Ugarit, the ancient city of Ugarit in Syria, also known as Ras Shamra. And those were discovered in the 1920s. And then in the 1940s, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the transition of greater and more accurate knowledge of Akkadian, so that people now could understand that there were distinct differences. It was a very distinct language, even belonging to a different language group within the Semitic languages than Hebrew. So that then people began to understand and didn't, what we had there is Pan-Akkadianism. Pan-Akkadianism meant that those during that period of time that were studying Akkadian and getting into it just attributed everything in Hebrew to Akkadian. We've passed by that. We're no longer Pan-Arabic, we're no longer Pan-Akkadian, we're no longer Pan-Ugaritic. We look at things now very carefully, scientifically, and objectively, and that has caused all this change. And with all that increase of knowledge and the increase of materials of these various Semitic languages from the 1940s through the 1960s, then in the 1970s, the debate just flowered. And with that debate being expanded and being fought in the journals and at meetings and conferences and in textbooks and in commentaries, then gradually in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the transition began to be made. And now that transition is virtually complete. I think one of the evidence of that was Practical and Van Pelt's textbook of Biblical Hebrew. When they first published it, their chapter on the wayik tol form of the verb dealt with a wow conversive. But very shortly, they discovered that that was an error. The more study they did, the more writing and research they did, the more interaction they had with others after that was published, they decided it was in error and they wrote a totally new chapter. But then the publisher, I think it was Zondervan, refused to reprint it. So they posted the revised chapter on their webpage, where they then come into agreement with what we've published here in our grammar, as opposed to what they had published originally. And so that's just an evidence of the transition. Theirs came a little bit too late. It was always amazing. How could you go that far and publish a grammar without settling that type of issue? But that's what happened to them. And they ended up by changing. And then the publisher was unwilling to reprint it with a changed chapter in it. Our publisher is Grace Books International. And it's going to stay there for the time being until we've finished up all the revisions, and then Lagos will put it in electronic format, publish it there. Craigle at one time was going to publish our grammar, and we got to talking, and the copyright and everything officially is with Grace Books International, and they're a formal publisher. Look at their book catalog online. They publish a lot of books, and we've decided that if that's the only way to get it published there, then that's where we're going to leave it. And we'd like to, once we've gotten all the revisions done and have it published electronically, we'd like to have it in a little bit more permanent binding. And so we're negotiating with Grace Books International to do that, or transition into some other publisher who has the resources to be able to do more of the hardback, because Grace Books International specializes primarily in paperbacks. And we've used a spiral binding because we felt the paperback binding was not good enough. It wouldn't hold together. It falls apart too quickly. So that gives you a little bit of background on what's happening there, and it gives you a little bit of background on the development that took place in the doing away with the concept of a wow conversive. And if you have anyone today that speaks of a wow conversive, or some have called it even a wow inversive, you know they're living in the past and they're ignoring all the research and all of the evidence from the 1940s through the 1980s, and have decided they're just going to live in the past and use the outmoded and outdated form of referring to the Hebrew verbs. And that system does not match. That can be demonstrated over and over and over and over again in parallel examples, and none of the major grammars will agree with it. So that's just the way it is. All right, Niffle Conjugation. You have the stem of this verb, the niffle, given for you on page 129 in the chart, all the way down that right-hand margin. Notice you have nictalti, that's the first common singular of the perfect. Notice it all has the ni on it. Nictalta, the second masculine singular. Nictalt, second feminine singular. Notice the endings are identical to what you've memorized with the cal perfect. Look over on the left-hand side there. Under the cal, active, and stative, the same endings, but you have a ni prefix in the perfect. That's why if you know the name, you've got the game. Niffle, nictalti, nictalta, nictalt, nictal. Notice the third masculine singular is exactly niffle, nictal. You have nictala, nictalnu, nictaltem, nictalten, nictalu. Ni on all perfects. On the imperfects, we have what is called the Niffle triangle. The Niffle triangle is that you have the prefix, the same imperfect prefix is used as anywhere else. Let's take the yod of the third masculine singular, and you go through it here, and what you have is you have a dogish in the first root letter. That's because the noon of the niffle is being assimilated into that root letter, all right? And so you have here yikatail, yikatail. And what happens is this dogish plus the comets and the hirik under the prefix form three elements of the niffle imperfect that we call the Niffle triangle. The Niffle triangle. Hirik, dogish, comets. Niffle triangle. It shows the noon has been assimilated. That's the third masculine singular here, the yod prefix. You have the same thing if you have ek, tail. You have the same triangle, except because you have the aleph here, you have the triangle this way, and I wiped out the one point here. All right, you still have the triangle. You have an I or E class vowel under the prefix. You have the dagesh in the first letter of the root. You have a comets under that first letter of the root. All Niffle imperfects will be like that. You go down through the line there, and you look at all the forms, and all of them have the Niffle triangle. The only one that has sigol is the aleph. That's the same you learned for the cow. Ektol, ekatel for the Niffle. All right? And we'll come back. We see the same thing in the imperative, because the imperative is formed from the imperfect. Notice there's a hey prefix put on the imperative. And we'll come back later on Thursday, and we'll talk more about the infinitives and the participles. But that's the key. The name, Niffle, for the perfect. The Niffle triangle for the imperfects.